Hello everyone. Thank you so much for coming today to World Vapers Alliance's press conference on Swedish smoking-free achievements, beat smoking like the Swedes. And today we are celebrating Sweden, which is on the path to becoming the first smoke-free country in Europe, which is achieving 5% of smoking rates, which means that Sweden is on the path to become the smoke-free country. And so today we have a very Swedish panel. So thank you, our dear guests, for joining us today and for participating in the discussion. And we are very happy to see a lot of discussions happening around Swedish and how its example could move forward across all other European countries. So today we have Michael Landel, the director of World Vapers Alliance, MEP Johan Nissinen, MEP Charlie Weimers, and Carissa During, the spokesperson for the consumer organization Considerate Pouchers. So thank you so much for coming. And as just for the format of our discussion, I will ask everyone some questions, and then we can move on to the questions from the audience. And we can start with Michael as a representative of the global consumer movement, and you've been doing a lot on promoting harm reduction. So could you tell us more about the role of Sweden for the harm reduction movement?
Yes, thank you. I think Sweden is for us a very important example because basically it's the third and final pillar for the pro-harm reduction argument. Because we already have the science. I think nobody in the science field denies that vaping, snus, nicotine pouches are less harmful than smoking, and all the studies point to that fact. Already in 2016 it was established by Public Health England that it's 95% less harmful, and time again science reconfirms that. So this pillar is pretty much fixed and sure, and there is no debate about it. And still nobody really, or almost nobody in the policy field at least, is following the science. And even though the second pillar of the pro-harm reduction argument is also clear, which is the consumers, and for us the most important argument, because about 80 million people vape already and 30 million more use snus and nicotine pouches. And those are not anecdotes, that is evidence that those kind of products help for smoking cessation, and that is crystal clear. We hear that all the time from especially vapers in our case, that they used to smoke for 30 years, tried everything, patches, gums, every possibility, and nothing worked, but those products work for them. So that is also kind of clear, but then we also hear the argument, yes, that's all good and fine, we have studies, but does it, and consumers are there, but that's anecdotes. Does it work in real life? And I think Sweden is the third and final pillar for the pro-harm reduction argument, because it shows that with a sensible, practical pro-harm reduction approach, you can achieve the goal of becoming smoke-free. And the interesting thing about it is if we compare the Swedish approach with others, because it's kind of satirical that is the country which has the one big exemption from EU rules has the best results. So Sweden slashed the smoking rates by 55% in the last decade, and that is, for example, 2 times faster than Spain, 6 times faster than Germany. So it clearly shows it works in real life as well. And from our point of view, the interesting part is that the average nicotine consumption is in Sweden very similar to that of the EU, but smoking-induced illnesses are about 20% lower. So what that shows to us is that it's not about nicotine consumption per se, but about the harm which comes from smoking cigarettes. And I think there we can learn a lot from Sweden, that we need to focus on the actual harm and risks of products and try to minimize them, and not start a kind of war against nicotine or consumption like many other countries unfortunately do. And that's why we try to showcase the Swedish example at the EU level and also in member states, but also try to encourage the Swedes themselves to push that story more and be more proud about this achievement, because it's a problem that nobody knows about the Swedish achievement, and that's what we try to change with our activities.
Thank you so much, Michael. MEP Nissinen, I will move to discussion to you. How is Sweden, and could you tell us more about what exactly Sweden was doing to achieve the smoke-free generation, which is also the pillar of the EU strategy to beat cancer, and should EU adopt a similar model in all 27 member states?
First of all, Sweden did like everybody else. They said that cigarettes is not good and give out the information. And for second, Sweden have a cultural history of snus, and that made for the third that we have an alternative. So all this combined made people go over to snus, and then when the nicotine pouches came, it became more popular by women and young people. So all these three things together like melted to a good solution. And I think that with this, we could export that to the rest of the EU countries, but it's important that every EU country need to find a model that works for their people, their culture, and we have a lot of alternatives: nicotine pouches, vaping, snus. Snus, I never think it's gonna be illegal in the rest of Europe, but you have the nicotine pouches and you have the vapings. So we can also learn from UK in this example, that UK is promoting the vaping by giving a vape to everyone who smokes and some money to buy nicotine, this fluid. So if the rest of the countries would be something similar, like promoting vaping or nicotine pouches, I think Europe could be smoke-free in the near future. Europe would already be smoke-free today if we would have done this from the beginning. No one would smoke today if we would have promoted all these alternatives. Sweden could also be smoke-free already if the government would have pushed this. So I really think that we should do it in Sweden also, pushing for the alternatives so the cigarettes finally gonna die out. Thank you.
Thank you so much. All right, MEP Weimers. So maybe we could talk also a little bit about the European Union and what is the EU doing to adopt harm reduction, and also perhaps what could be done differently.
Indeed. The fact that the European Union is about to adopt new legislation on tobacco taxes and tobacco products, it provides us with an important opportunity to actually include a harm reduction perspective, building on the Swedish experience. As was mentioned, Sweden is about to be classified by the WHO as a smoke-free country, and there's a reason for that. I mean, I can just to be a bit personal, mention one example. My aunt and my mother, they were born around the same year, 1950, around that. And they both smoked from the age of like 14. And my mother went over to snus 10, 15 years ago. My aunt continued to smoke, and my aunt sadly passed away. My mother is alive. And tobacco-related illnesses ruined the last years of my aunt's life. That's the reality of and the consequences of policies enacted here in Brussels. People's lives could be saved, or not. So when lobbyists against any kind of nicotine use are trying to question our integrity, they question our will to actually help people move to less harmful products, which is what we want. Now, the BECA process in the European Parliament was, for me, a very positive surprise in the sense that amendments that I tabled were included in the compromises, proposing that scientific evaluation on new nicotine products are to be pursued. This is new. One would think that it'd be natural to do that. But no, that has not been the case, as it was in Sweden. Now Sweden, the Swedish population, by their own, chose a less harmful alternative to smoking. But the political establishment, they refused to acknowledge that. They refused for many years to talk about harm reduction. But now in Sweden, you see a very clear political move by a majority in the parliament in favor of a harm reduction perspective. And those fighting this, they are terrified, because what they've done is to move from a vision of a smoke-free society to a vision of a nicotine-free society. And in the run-up to this press conference, I saw that it was written that snus has a strong connection to oral cancer. That is not true. I brought this to show you that there is nothing, not a warning about cancer on these cans. When I was young, before the year of 2000, there was, because they didn't evaluate it scientifically until then. And then they came to the conclusion, we cannot claim this from the government authorities. So there is no clear connection between cancer and nicotine, as we do know. But it's also acknowledged on these cans that it's not. So the European Union must learn from this. It must accept that life is not perfect. I mean, this is not a health product. People like to use it anyway. And a sound policy would recognize reality rather than being utopian. So this is what we see ahead of us, is a fight between utopianism or puritanism and pragmatism that really looks at the well-being of people.
Yeah, actually, I would like to turn the conversation, thank you so much, MEP Weimers. I would like to turn the conversation to Carissa. And as a Swedish consumer, as a nicotine pouches consumer, and now as a spokesperson for the for nicotine pouches, could you share more from Swedish people if something else needs to be done in Sweden per se?
So I think what's very important is that we keep promoting the benefits that snus has, so it doesn't move towards a more strict regulation. Because we've been seeing that traditional tobacco snus had great benefits, especially for men who has used it the most, but also since the introduction of tobacco-free alternatives, the usage has increased within the youth and also women who traditionally weren't that interested in tobacco snus. And a big part of this is that we also have flavors, things that are more appealing to youth and women. So I think this is also very important that we recognize that we shouldn't ban the flavors, because that is also something that is very important for the switch from smoking to nicotine pouches.
Thank you so much. I would also like to address the audience if you have any questions to our speakers, because I was just having probably one more for myself as a follow-up to what's been said before. Now that we were talking that Belgium is planning to ban nicotine pouches, Netherlands are planning to ban, and there is a lot of proposals to ban flavors. What do you think we could change in the perspective of the member states as well?
I mean, I think it's a general problem, and Charlie mentioned it already. I think parts of the opponents of harm reduction, they adopted this kind of war on drugs mentality and lost the actual goal out of sight. And our goal should always be to reduce actual harms. And if we have this goal in our head as first priority, I think it's quite clear, because as I say, those products are way less harmful, and then it's already logic that it's good if people already smoke. When they switch to those products, that it's a benefit for harm reduction. This should be clear for every member state, for all EU institutions. Unfortunately, that's not the case in many of the countries, and I think that's why it's so important to educate people, because a lot of misconceptions are out there and a lot of lack of knowledge. I think just a lot of people don't know the facts, and obviously if we can get an informed citizenship or informed people in the countries, they will put pressure on the politicians to follow their lead as well. And I think we have seen that what happens if the EU Commission leaks a draft, or a draft got leaked, without an exemption for snus in the taxation regulation, then Swedish people know that snus is good, they consume it, and they know it's less harmful. So everyone was up in arms and said that's not possible. And as far as I could see, it had almost nothing to do with party lines. That was just out of the question that taxation could be increased that much for snus. And I think we need to get to this point in other countries as well, because that would benefit us as consumers and public health in general.
If I may just add one thing, in your report, which contains a lot of interesting statistics, I would especially recommend to have a look at the decrease of smoking in different countries. I mean, a country like Sweden then was able to decrease in the last 10 years 5.9% annually smoking. I mean, it's a great success. Compare that with Australia, which has had a very Puritan legislation on these new nicotine products. They have hardly been able to fight smoking at all. So these are the consequences of policy decisions, and people dying will be the final consequence of that Puritanism. So have a look at the report and fight the Belgian or Dutch proposals with these facts. Facts matter.
All right, Adam?
First of all, a bit of a funny one. Why do you think English-speaking countries are better when it comes to vaping regulation? But second, what would you prefer, especially policymakers in the room, what would you prefer for the future of the European Union? Do you think that there needs to be more harmonization based on the scientific evidence and kind of, an agreement between EU member states that these harm reduction policies in Sweden worked well, so maybe the next tobacco products directive should allow for as much use of these products as possible? Or do you think that there is a benefit of these diverse kind of regulatory frameworks within the EU, and it enables us free marketeers to compare policies and see what works better and what works less?
The first question, why the Anglo-Saxon countries are more successful in this, I think it's because they have more, we see a problem, we solve it. And then they saw that vaping is a solution, and also it's they could maybe have chosen also snus and the nicotine pouches, but they have another view on that than we have. And when it comes to EU level, I think we should open up the legislation a little bit more, so the countries can have the freedom to choose what's best for them. Because all countries have different culture, different way of thinking, and if you open up, they can find a model that are better for them, and then can learn from other countries that actually works.
It is very hard to say why Anglo-Saxon oriented countries in Europe are more open to harm reduction than other EU countries, because if you look internationally, I just mentioned Australia, you have New Zealand as well, with definitely not a very open attitude. So it can't be that it's inherently cultural. It must be something else. Maybe research that been highlighted in those European countries that you mentioned that played a role in shaping opinion. That would be my bet. But when it comes to upcoming legislation, I was happy as long as nicotine pouches, for instance, was not very much regulated by the European Union, because that allowed for institutional competition, which is a great thing, which is basically learning from best practice, and I would very much want that to continue. But what I see is that it is going to be an EU-wide legislation. I'm going to fight it as much as I can, but it is going to happen. realistically speaking. So what we can do is, of course, to learn from the British experience, which is pursuing a very open-minded approach towards vaping and nicotine pouches and so on and so forth, and compare the success in decreasing smoking rates between the UK and the European Union, and hopefully using that example to influence this upcoming legislation would be a very effective thing to do as well.
Maybe just one sentence. I also normally I would say I'm a bit skeptical about this one-size-fits-all rules, but obviously within the European Union in a common market, it doesn't really make sense to not at least have some kind of standardized regulation for those products, because otherwise we open up the black market and smuggling within the EU for those kind of things. So I think we need both approaches. Obviously one which is open enough for the cultural differences, but also one where we have the general basics regulated the same in all countries, which in our case would be the minimum amount of regulation, and obviously the worst case scenario would be a EU-wide flavor ban, because then we see from the Australian example what's happening. Then we will have the same effects, which are black market and illicit trade and home mixing of flavors and those kind of things, which are can all be dangerous. So I think it must be a sensible mix. Whether especially the EU Commission will be open to that, I'm a bit skeptical. But as I said, we do everything we can to push at least the Parliament into the right direction, and I think then we can get some sensible approach to harm reduction in those products.
Thank you, Peter.
Why Sweden is so different. In many countries we have traditions of some chewing tobacco, and somehow that did not prevent from these countries not fighting for an exemption as Sweden did with the result. And I think I want to take it broader. If you look at the COVID pandemic, surprisingly also on health policy, Sweden stood out, and I think now every expert accepts that. Is this because of certain health policy establishment in Sweden?
I would just say again, it's a cultural thing. The snus is a cultural thing. It have how and when we don't know. It have been really established that the snus is very cultural. It's belong to the Swedish heart. So that's why that's why it's so strong, and why it's not have been they're fighting for it. So we saw last year when they talked about the taxes, and the Swedes got they almost became Vikings, and now we're gonna fight here. And when it comes to the COVID, even if Sweden maybe is a little bit sometimes a very socialist country, you do what the government say, blah 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 blah, we still have some core of individual freedom. So having a lockdown in Sweden would have never worked, because the Swedes would never accepted it, because you take their freedom away. And in this case, the freedom is very important.
Mm.
I think these two issues are somewhat similar, like Johan said, somewhat different as well. I mean, when it comes to snus, the tradition is there, yeah, and it played a huge role when Sweden negotiated its EU membership, which was done before the referendum back in 1994, right? So the margin was very small, very thin for the pro-EU side. And the fact that they gained the majority was thanks to the negotiated derogation from the ban on wet tobacco. That is Sweden's only formal derogation in its EU history. We don't even have a derogation from the euro, for instance. So that says something about how important this is. And of course, it has with innovation to do as well. When I was a kid, snus was associated with old men. And you had to sort of shape your snus, and it was not very fresh, maybe considered by many. Now you have pouches, and that was an innovation by the industry that really helped reduce smoking in Sweden, really expanded the market. And so that's a reason why Sweden did as it did compared with other countries who did not negotiate any derogations. They really decided on EU membership. When it comes to COVID, I think, yes, individual freedom, but also the fact that ministers are not allowed in Sweden to directly instruct government agencies what to do. So I think quite a few socialist politicians felt frustrated when the health agency refused to implement stricter rules because the politicians appeared impotent at that moment. But now in retrospect, I think they are very, very grateful that this division between agencies and government is there. So that's a very important reason as well. In Italy, a minister can go directly into a government agency and tell them what to do and appear forceful. And that led to lockdowns.
Yeah, so to give a little historical context to snus in Sweden, back in the 1700s, all over Europe, we used a powdered version of tobacco that you would inhale. And with time, that became less and less popular, but in Sweden, in the 1800s, the farmers started cultivating their own tobacco and then making it into a mass that you can put under your lip. Because when they were working in the fields, they needed their both hands to work. So that's when they started by themselves making snus at home. And then 1822, the first snus was released, the first industry version. And since then it just grew in popularity, and as was said, when the portion version comes in the 70s, that was a huge benefit and a huge change in the Swedish market. That's when snus became highly popularized, and the switch from smoking really started happening because more people, I think that when people can choose a healthier alternative to smoking, that's also what they want to do. So then you see increase in the usage of snus, and we see the same increase of switching from smoking to snus since the nicotine pouches, the tobacco-free nicotine pouches came. So as you've seen, snus has been used for 200 years in Sweden. That is a long time, and it's, as said, something that is very deeply rooted in our culture. So that is something that we are also very willing to protect, which is seen when we entered the European Union and we negotiated this fact. So there is a big historical context, and I think that also speaks for itself that we've had it for almost 200 years because it's not something that's new. It's not something that's new and dangerous and that has never been tried before. We've had it for 200 years. This is something that we've really thought of and tried out, and it's working. So I think that speaks for itself.
I'm not sure if I'm allowed, but one follow-up question to this. I wanted to seize the opportunity we're sitting there with three Swedes, because I'm always wondering from a consumer citizen's perspective, but also policy's perspective. So Sweden is about to become smoke-free, reaching the EU target 17 years ahead, and I'm always wondering, or thinking nobody really knows about this. And then I imagine if it would happen in Germany, France, Italy, that would be all over the news. Italians would be bragging about it, how well they did. But with Sweden, that is not the case. And it seems like the Swedes themselves don't want to tell the Swedish story. And I can't really figure out what the reason is for that, or why not to show other countries how it's actually done.
I think it's have a little bit with Swedishness, that you are very modest and you don't want to brag. Except when you hear Swedes say, in Sweden we have a model. So, but we should brag a little bit more.
Yeah, I really think we should. I do think that it has with the former official policy of Swedish governments to do, not really endorsing harm reduction. I worked for the last center-right Swedish government, and I followed these issues very closely in the Ministry of Social Affairs. It was very controversial, and the government really did not shape a clear line on these issues at the time. But now, 10 years has passed, and the parliament is now in favor of a harm reduction perspective. And I think if you start to ask Swedish leading politicians today, they will use another more assertive language on this in favor of harm reduction. So maybe the time has come for the Swedes to leave modesty, back at home and speak out clearly. I hope so.
I really agree with you. I think it's partly because we've had a perspective that we should be pure and have nothing. And since Sweden has adopted a more harm reduction approach, that should also be more reflected. But I've also seen when I speak with people on the streets, when we're doing campaigns and telling Swedes that we are almost becoming smoke-free, most of them don't know that. Which is very interesting. How come that the Swedes themselves don't know how good we are doing? So I think that is also a big part of it, because since the Swedish people themselves are not aware of how well we are actually doing, then we don't see a reason to promote it. And that's why informing also the European Union and the countries in Europe, but also the Swedes themselves that, hey, look at what we're doing. We're doing it really good, and more people should follow that example. I think that's a huge part of it too, because then the people will put pressure on their politicians so that they can bring this issue forward and also promote it more in the European Union.
All right, do you have any more questions? No. All right. Well, I have to say I'm very happy we have here 3 Swedes who are working to brag a little bit about the Swedish success, and World Vapers Alliance is also helping in these efforts. We have the campaign with Smoking Like the Swedes. There is a fact sheet on Swedish achievements, and so WVA is doing a lot of efforts in campaigns to actually raise awareness, not only in Sweden or not only in Brussels, but also in other member states, about the importance of the Swedish model for the whole Europe and the whole world. And well, thank you again to everyone for coming. Thank you so much, our dear guests, for participating today. And stay tuned to learn more from World Vapers Alliance and follow the work of considerate poachers. And thank you, MEP Weimers and MEP Nissinen, for all your support to harm reduction.